now.
I know our speaker today knows her subject extraordinarily well, and I think that you will get carried along as she tells you about her family's background. And I'm delighted really to introduce Marsha Raimi, who has a story to tell.
Thank you. Thanks, Dean. I think we need yeah. Thank you. All right, let me just have a pretty strong voice here. I don't want to overwhelm you guys, and it looks like I'm going to need my glasses to read my notes. So thank you all for coming today, and I wish my talk was not quite as timely as it is. History is a collective choices of individuals, but often those individuals get swept up in large events without a choice. I tell my family story so that everybody knows that it happened to real people, to deny the deniers, to recover the stories. In Holocaust education, we talk about there not being a single Holocaust of 6 million Jews. It is 6 million individual Holocausts. My dad was a survivor. What happened 85 years ago in Poland and Europe is relevant to Nashville now. Anti-Semitism and other hatred begins with speech, escalates to denial of rights, and ends with murder. I'm asking everybody here today to join me and learn about this so that you can be an ally, to be alert to signs of discrimination and fight. So a little bit of a history review. I'm sure you all are well aware of World War II history, but just a little review here. At the end of World War I, Germany felt that it got a pretty raw deal with the armistice, and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which Nazi is an acronym for the German words, started in 1920. In 1923, Adolf Hitler was involved in a coup attempt, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. While he was in jail, he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which was an autobiographical manifesto. Volume 1 was published in 1925 and Volume 2 in 1926. Now, Hitler's ideas were not new. Anti-Semitism is said to be the oldest hatred. There's often a debate about whether Jews are a religion, a culture, a tribe, and we do consider ourselves a people. We had our own religion, culture, and language. It was portable, expandable. It was actually very countercultural when it started, and our rituals and language have often kept us apart from other nations. In the prevailing biblical times, pantheism or paganism was prevalent. There were many gods, and the king was a god. In monotheism, we believe there is only one invisible God, so we don't bow down to men. Well, of course, many kings didn't like this. Also, the idea of the fifth column arose even in the Bible. There was a new Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph. He was worried that they become too numerous and will side with our enemies. In the Middle Ages, there was the blood libel that accused Jews of using the blood of Christian children for our pagan rituals. We were limited in our professions, often the money lender, the landlord, or the tax collector, so we were between the nobles and the peasants. We lived in segregated places, sometimes by choice, but often in a ghetto, which that word is actually from Italian, where the first ghetto was in Venice in the early 17th century. So Hitler basically just repackaged and marketed anti-Semitism, and he added the chutzpah, the nerve, to take it all the way to its logical conclusion. So this is what he said in Mein Kampf. I'm not going to read to you, you can all read, but his emotional appeal was the fear of others, the fear of people who are different from you. They were going to take your rightful place in society. They're trying to conquer the world, the Jews along with the communists, and we're going to blame them for every one of our personal and country's miseries. The propaganda message was the bare essentials, was that the Germans were Aryans. They were a superior race, Übermenschen. They needed Lebensraum, living space to expand, so that other nationalities had to give way. Jews were not even human. Their country would be Judenrein, Jew-free. Jews were merely vermin to be gotten rid of. Similarly, the destruction of weak and sick people is humane. Handicapped people, Roma, Sinti, LGBT plus individuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, Bolsheviks, and what they called degenerate artists were all targets for the Nazi Party. So I just want to show a couple pieces. They were masters at propaganda and marketing. They filled every media they had available. I mean, really, social media could take a lot of cues from how effective the Nazis were. They used radios, rallies, posters, the Olympics, films, even the Hitler Youth were all forms of propaganda. The piece on the left is called The Wandering or Eternal Jew from 1937. This is the stereotyped idea of what a Jew looked like, and these were the people to be gotten rid of. The money in the hand, the large nose, the clothing that they wore, the the Russian symbol on then there's like a little whip. Then the piece on the right associates any of the Nazis' enemies with Jews. It says they're all Jews. They're either all Jews or Jew lovers. So that's all the Allied political leaders in the piece on the right. So a weak democracy can be destroyed from within. One party can gain the popular vote and then remove all checks and balances. So Hitler did a study after he got out of the jail. The Nazi Party, led by Hitler, did a steady advance on breaking down the democracy in Germany, while breaking ties with the West and gaining political allies in the East. The goal was always to restrict and isolate Jews. They meant to force all the Jews out of Germany. Of course, the Jews they thought they were Germans. They didn't want to leave. They thought things will get better. It was a constant drip, drip, drip of persecutions and the denial of rights. Finally, in 1935, they enacted the Nuremberg laws, which defined who is a Jew. They studied, this is the disturbing part that I learned, they studied actually the racial laws of the United States regarding slaves. In the US, if you had a single drop of Negro blood, you were considered black. The Nazis decided to not go quite that far. They used 25%. If one of your 4 grandparents was Jewish, they considered you Jewish. And at that time, the Nazis just wanted to force all the Jews out of Germany. They weren't prepared to kill them yet. They just wanted their land to be Juden-free, Judenrein. So they were trying to create many refugees. They were trying to force them to the east. But other countries around the world were not accepting refugees. There was limited immigration laws everywhere. In the US in particular, while Cordell Hull, here from Tennessee, was Secretary of State in 1933 to 1944, there were historic low levels of immigration into the US. Now, Jean spoke to you back in May about the May family who rescued many German Jews between the period of 1928 to 1938. And I didn't get to hear that talk, but I'm sure it was wonderful. But when we give a tour at the Nashville Holocaust Memorial, we talk about the May family and the influence that the difference one person can make. So finally, the Anschluss in March 1938 incorporated the traditional land of Austria into Germany, and Kristallnacht in Berlin, 1938, when all the Jewish synagogues, homes, and businesses were looted and set afire. That basically slammed the door shut on any opportunity of getting out of Europe. Even then, 72% of Americans were against increasing immigration. So we'll take a pause here and make this personal. This is my father's family. He's the young man on the right-hand side. His name at that time was Bezalel Rangevertz. He was born October 25th, 1924 in the town of Moava. So he's about 13 and a half here. Moava is a town of about 25,000 people. At that time, about 7,000 of them were Jews, or about almost 30%. My grandfather on the left, his name was Yechiel. He was born in a much smaller town nearby called Nishelsk. The whole town's population there was 7,000, but fully half were Jewish. Now, grandfather Yechiel is 48 here. And I think you'll see, you know, if you exaggerate a lot of his features and his dress, you'll see the similarity to that Wandering Jew propaganda piece. My grandmother on the right was named Leah Filar. She was only 46 here, but I think she looks so much older. She looks so careworn and sad. They had lost their oldest daughter, Pearl, within a year before that. The parents had not approved of the young man my aunt had fallen in love with, and she committed suicide. They were also about to lose their oldest son. It's Meyer seated between them. He's 16 and a half. This picture was taken on the occasion of him immigrating to Detroit. Three of Yechiel's brothers already lived there, and one of his uncles, and they were trying to get out as many of the family members as wanted to come. So my Uncle Meyer was the last one that was able to be taken out. So, and then the girls, the beautiful young lady in the back was named Chaya. She's about 18 or 19 here. And next to my dad is Frimet. She's about 12. And the youngest was named Malka. She's about 8 or 10 at that time, and that is who I'm named in memory of. This family had a very typical life, as an urban life. Grandfather owned a wholesale grocery store. His brother, Meyer, owned a grain export business, and both of them were right on the main town square. And their father-in-law, they married sisters. Meyer married Leah's sister, and Leah and Gittel's father, Yosef, he owned a leather goods store, again, right on the main square. And so my dad at one time made a list of all the family members that he could remember that were lost in the Holocaust. It was 41 people. I only recently learned that this was only on his mother's side, just from this town of Moava. And out of this picture, within 6 years, only the two young men in the picture were still alive. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about what life was like. My grandparents were what's known as Hasidic Jews. Hasidism arose in the 18th century in the east of Polish-Lithuania Commonwealth. It asserts God's eminence in the world and incorporated mystical and ideas and practices at the time, and emphasized the joy of worship. Each rabbi created his own rabbinic court and dynasty. So the founder of the Ger sect was a man named Rabbi Isaac Meir Alter, and that was formed in 1860. My great-grandmother's father was one of his principal students. The picture here is of his grandson Mordechai Leib Alter, about 1920. And of course, he's the one in the middle with the longest beard. And he actually, I know it's hard to believe, but this guy was like a rock star. He actually had followers all over Poland. It's estimated that he had 100,000 followers, which made this particular sect the largest and most influential one in Poland. And because there was no separation of church and state in Poland at that time, political parties were often based around religion. And as I said, in my grandfather's and my father's hometowns, it was 30%, 50% Jewish. And this was pretty prevalent throughout Poland. So the Jewish people actually had political parties. The Zionism was also arising at this time in the late 1890s. And they advocated the creation of a Jewish state in what was then British Mandate Palestine. But the religious Jews did not support Zionism because they said, we will only have Israel back when the Messiah comes. And, you know, we don't believe that Christ is the Messiah, so we didn't think the Messiah was coming yet. So the various Hasidic sects, they jointly founded a political party called Agudat Yisrael in 1912. They actually had seats in the Polish parliament until the Nazis invaded the country. And in the picture on the right, the gentleman circled is one of my dad's double cousins. This is the editorial board for the newspaper of this Agudat Yisrael party. And this sect of Judaism and political party still exist in Israel. This is a picture from my grandfather's hometown of Nashville. This is what's called a cheder, which was the school. Is a religious school. This picture is from 1937. There probably is some of my grandfather's relatives on my grandfather's side in this picture. The gentleman with the white beard who circled has the same last name as my grandmother. I haven't established the connection yet, but pretty likely that they were related. He was the head of the religious studies. The little boy circled on the far right is now a 99-year-old man named Maury Chandler who lives in Detroit and Florida. And I will be talking about him quite a bit later on with some of the surprising Tennessee connections. Both my dad and Mr. Chandler have recorded their testimony for Yad Vashem, for a project in the University of Michigan in Detroit, and for the USC Shoah Foundation. And it's remarkably similar when they talk about their boyhoods of what these schools were like and how long the hours of study were, how difficult it was. The study was mostly, the everyday language was Yiddish, the study language was Hebrew, and the prayer language was Hebrew. And of course, many of the people, especially people like my grandfather who had businesses, also had to speak Polish. So, you know, my dad already grew up pretty much trilingual at that time. And, you know, and if you got your lessons wrong, you know, there was corporal punishment. You know, those teachers could do whatever they wanted to the boys. There were girls' schools too, but they were segregated. So my aunts actually did go to religious school as well. There was some secular studies. And then their father or grandfather on the Sabbath, after praying and after the meal, their father or grandfather would quiz them on the lessons of the week. So if they didn't know the lessons, well, they might get a chap from their parent too. So, but they also talk about how beautiful welcoming the Sabbath on Friday night was, and the special meal, and that was the once a week you had a bath, and the whole family sang, and how beautiful that was. So it was a very rich Yiddish cultural life in these towns and throughout Poland. There was a full spectrum of charities, schools, theaters, libraries, music, politics, books. In the memorial book for my dad's town, there was all these pictures. There's about 9 or 10 Zionist groups on the left. My dad did belong to one of those, although he's not in that picture. And then again, the Zionism was so strong that many of these young adults were training to go be laborers in, again, British Mandate Palestine. It's not Israel yet. So the gentleman on the right was one of my dad's double cousins. He's actually a brother to the guy who was the editor of the religious political newspaper. They were brothers. And this one, he went to Israel, and he's helping build literally the state of Israel with his bare hands. And my second cousin, his daughter, does have a family album from Poland that includes this picture. And of course, this seemingly somewhat idyllic, or at least manageable life came to an end very abruptly on September 1st, 1939. The official start of World War II began with the invasion of Poland. And then, of course, the Blitzkrieg, where the Germans overtook 9 countries in 2 years without a defeat. The city of Mława fell on September 10th, like almost immediately, and it was annexed to Germany 6 weeks later, just the day after my father turned 15. Polish resistors, intelligentsia, they were actually the first ones who were sent to the concentration camps or shot, because Germans didn't want anybody resisting them. So, people still lived in their towns. The Nuremberg laws were immediately enacted in all occupied territories, whereas in Germany it took 3 years of drip, drip, drip. It was immediate in any of the countries in the Blitzkrieg. They had to wear the yellow star. Their papers were marked with a J. Their middle name for a man was changed to Israel, or for a woman to Sarah. There was rationing of food. Their property was sometimes confiscated. And anybody who helped a Jew was subject to the death penalty. There was a hierarchy. Of course, Jews were the vermin. They were the absolute worst, but there were that whole other series of undesirables. And even the non-Germans, the Aryans didn't want so much. They were willing to use them and co-opt them to get rid of the Jews, but ultimately they didn't really like even non-Aryans so much. So they took advantage of historical suspicion and jealousy amongst the local populations to make them collaborate. Just a year after that occupation, the ghetto wall was built. And this is a post-war picture, but that's the one picture of the wall in town. Of course, it was in the poorest part of town. There was overcrowding, which leads to, bad health conditions, not enough food. My dad and his sisters, though, were able to still go back and forth between their ghetto and the Warsaw ghetto, which was the biggest one in Poland, and trade back and forth and smuggle food from the countryside into one of these two cities. And that is actually where my dad and Mr. Chandler met, was in the Warsaw ghetto, because my dad was quote unquote dating Mr. Chandler's cousin at that time. Yeah, and I just learned that very recently. And another insidious rule that the Germans had was that they forced the Jews to police themselves. Once a ghetto was instituted, they required the Jews to form what was called the Judenrat, which is the Jewish council, and the leaders of the Jewish council had to carry out the German orders amongst the population. So if there was, they needed 100 people for conscripted labor, the leaders of the Jewish council had to find those 100 people. So once Germany took over Poland, they had an even bigger problem with the Jews than they imagined with Germany. Germany only had about 600,000 Jews pre-war. Poland had 3 million. Okay, they couldn't even kick out all the German Jews. Now what are you gonna do with all these Polish Jews? No other countries were accepting them. So there was the big question of the final solution of the Jewish problem. And the German High Command had a conference, Wannsee Conference, you probably heard of that, in January 42. It was logistics. They already had decided that they were going to kill all the Jews. This is just the logistics of how are we going to go about doing this. We can't do this all at once. We can't shoot them all. So they decided upon, first they're going to concentrate all the Jews in certain areas, and then either we'll kill them off through labor and poor rations, or we'll actually kill them. And because there were so many Jews in Poland, most of these camps were established in Poland. So there were 5 camps that were actually designated as strictly extermination camps. Most of them were concentration camps. And of course, the most infamous one was Auschwitz, which is where my dad ended up. The town of Mława was, the ghetto was liquidated in November and December 1942. And my dad arrived in Auschwitz on November 24th, 1942. And this is the roll of where he was assigned his number. His name is on the top line, Betzalel Rangewertz. And as you can see, there's another Rangewertz right behind him that was one of his double cousins who did not make it. And I'm sure if you've read anything about the Holocaust, especially like Elie Wiesel's Night, my dad went through all of those experiences, the selections, the horrible weather, you know, the thin pajamas, the clogs on their feet, the roll calls, beatings. Often it seemed that suicide was really the only way out. But my dad did have one saving grace at the beginning. 150 young men from his transport, so many from his town, they were chosen to be enrolled in what was called a Marschule. It was a bricklayer school. Of course, at that time, you know, the Nazis were undergoing a mass infrastructure campaign. They were doubling the size of Auschwitz itself and many other facilities throughout the country. So they needed trained labor. So this was a school to teach these young men how to be bricklayers. The original part of Auschwitz had been an army, Polish army post. So that first winter, my dad, and some of his friends were in a brick barrack. And he attributes that partially to his survival, because that was a brutal winter. They got a little bit better rations. There was a Michigan State University professor who did a microhistory of this Marschule. He calculated about 1,000 young men went through that through from 42 through 44, calculated that their survival rate was about 22%. While the average survival rate of the camps was only about 1 or 2%. So, you know, my dad was right. That probably helped him survive. And in the enrollment lists of these, of course, this is just a snippet. There were 2 other double cousins on grandmother's side with the last name of Filar, who were also in this camp. So he had the support of, you know, family and friends. Once he graduated from the school, he was forced labor for the IG Farben chemical factory, which was 2 kilometers outside the main camp, until January 1945. And of course, by that time, the Allies, the tide of the war had changed and the Allies were starting to win. The Soviets were coming in from the east, and in December and January of December 44, January 45, the Germans were moving the Jews out of the Auschwitz camp. So my dad arrived in another camp called Buchenwald, which is in Germany, on January 26, 1945. It was the day before the Soviet army liberated Auschwitz. Well, only 7,000 people were there. They were the absolute sickest ones. My dad was still a relatively healthy younger man, so he was able to go and be labor for another 3 months in Buchenwald. And then in March 45, when the American forces were advancing from the west, he was on one of those death marches. So he marched across Germany in March and April, was liberated on April 23rd, 1945, near Hamm, Bavaria, after about a 100-mile march. And this is his enrollment card as a displaced person. The Allied United Forces set up many camps and places for, there was millions of refugees after the war, not just Jews. Well, a lot of them were Jews, but it was not just Jews. It was anybody who was displaced because of the war. Of course, many of the non-Jews went back to their original home places, but most of the Jews had no desire to return. So, you know, my dad was free, but he had no home, he had no family, no income. It wasn't a daily struggle for survival because the Allies provided their goods, but he was alone and adrift. He met a GI who was from Detroit, and he remembered, miraculously to me, he remembered his brother's address in Detroit after all those years of the war, and one of their uncles, and he wrote to them. We have those letters from that GI informing them that my father was alive. The Allies set up the International Tracing Service to just find out, you know, take censuses. They were taking weekly census of who you are, where you are from, do you know of people who were lost, and publishing those letters those lists, survival lists and not survival lists. My dad was hoping, he knew that his parents most likely didn't make it because they were just too old. They were almost 50. You know, but he was praying that his three sisters had made it through too. He did go back to their town. When he got to his grandmother's house, the former Polish caretaker answered the door. He said, "What are you doing here? I thought they got rid of all of you." So my dad had no desire to return to Poland, and he never did visit after. So this is a picture, on the left is a picture January 1948. He sent to his brother Meyer in Detroit, and he inscribed it in English on the back. So in the 3.5 years that he was living in the DP camp, he learned English. Now, chronologically, this is only 10 years after the first picture that we saw of my dad. But I think psychologically it was a lifetime. He went from being a hopeful boy with dreams of being a cantor with a family to being a sad, lost young man. He was going to go to Detroit and join my uncle, but I don't know why. I haven't found anything in my research to tell me why he changed his mind. But once Israel declared statehood in May of 1948, he joined a flood of survivors, and in August of 1948, he moved to Israel. And he was immediately enlisted as a soldier in the war for independence in Israel, which is it's pretty ironic, me giving this talk today, as Israel is once again fighting for its survival. So the picture on the right is my dad in Tel Aviv. Of course, he's the one on the right. The gentleman on the left is the picture we saw before of that young, skinny bricklayer from about 25 years before that. And my dad's double cousin, and of course his wife and their oldest son. And he was either a plasterer or a bricklayer. There's some debate between me and my siblings. But Israel still was a very hard life. It was a brand new country. It was a desert. And there was actually some discrimination against these survivors. The people who had made Aliyah, which is the Hebrew word for moving to Israel, you know, at earlier time periods felt like we were the real Zionists. We were the ones who were dedicated to this idea of a Jewish state. If you had been more dedicated, you wouldn't have stayed in Europe. You would have come over here before the war. You went like sheep to the slaughter. It took many years for that attitude to dissipate in Israel with, you know, the growing understanding of what it was really like in Europe. So finally in 1953, my dad decided that he did want to go to Detroit and join his brother. And he applied for immigration, but guess what? Those laws are still really tight. He waited 2 years. He lived in Windsor, Canada, which is right across the river from Detroit, before he was able to immigrate. And almost as soon as he did immigrate, he met my mother, who was a Detroit native, Ruth Crandall, in January of 1956. They married in June, and they had 4 kids in 6 years. So I grew up there. I didn't think anything of having that many siblings so close together. We love it. It's great. He changed his name to Sal Raimi after my older brother was born, and he was naturalized 2 months before my birth. My dad still did physical labor his whole life. His education was cut short at 8th grade. He was a very smart man, read, could do math in his head. He made a very good living as a scrap metal dealer, which Mr. Chandler actually helped him get into that profession. We had a very nice, suburban lifestyle in Detroit. When the Holocaust Center opened in West Bloomfield, Michigan in 1982, Dad was amongst the first survivors to meet visitor groups, mostly non-Jewish students. That's what he liked the best because he felt that he could have the most influence over them. As I mentioned before, he recorded his testimony for all those major projects. And as I said at the beginning, and now I've picked up his legacy of denying the deniers. To the end of his life, he wanted to make sure that others understood the dangers of discrimination and hatred. And the message that he had to his fellow Jews was to be proud of who you are and to not hide, to not, deny your Judaism, to be proud and to stand up for yourself. So this is Dad's very proud legacy. This is the most complete picture of our extended family, from my daughter Sarah in the middle with the white dress at her bat mitzvah. She was the oldest grandchild. There were 2 other grandchildren born before my parents died, but we couldn't get everybody together again after that. So the golden chain of Jewish tradition was restored. And again, just to show, when you think about the magnitude of what was lost between, my dad's siblings and his father and mother's siblings, just quick rundown here of what these folks are doing. Most of the brothers and brother-in-law are in some kind of software, as is the young man on the right. He actually lives in Israel now, and he left Tel Aviv on Sunday afternoon. My daughter is also in software. The little girl on the left is a OBGYN in her 3rd year of residency. The one next to her has just started urban planning, a master's degree at Harvard. And my cute little boy chick there in the middle is an engineer in Alabama. And the one with the big gap-toothed smile is a Jewish matchmaker. During the pandemic, he started a Facebook group that has 75,000 young people on it. There have been several marriages. So the turning point in my story, my dad is one of the exceptions that talked about his experiences and did record stuff. But, I just lived my life. I was going on with my profession, having my kids. I didn't do a whole lot. I knew about it and I would answer questions when people asked. But big turning point for me was in 2018, I went on a trip to Poland with my sister and brother-in-law and my new husband. My sister suggested I read this book on the left, 3 Minutes in Poland. So that book also starts in 1938. Glenn Kurtz's grandfather and grandmother returned to their hometown, which was Nashville, and he did 3 minutes of a home movie. And Glenn was able to restore it, and he put it up on the Yad Vashem website. And who should recognize it but this Maury Chandler? So there are a lot of Mr. Chandler's stories in this book. And in that book, he says, my dad was from Nashville. My dad never talked about Nashville. I didn't know the whole time my dad was talking about his mother's side of the family. There's a whole other side of the family in this other town, which is only half an hour away. So we went to both of the towns, and actually my sister also told me that one of our second cousins, she had written a book about her grandparents and their experiences in the Shells. So that's where I figured out that my grandfather was born in the Shells and moved to Moava because they married the Filler sisters. Then a few years later, a documentarian also came across this film on the Yad Vashem website, and she became very intrigued and wanted to make it full length. She wanted the people in these 3 minutes to stay longer and to know their stories. She made it into a 69-minute documentary, which I was able to get a screening of it last year. It made the film festivals and everything last year. So that's 3 minutes of lengthening. So my second trip to Poland was last year in May for 2 days of activities in Nashville and Warsaw surrounding the screening of the film in Warsaw at their documentary film festival. We also had a screening in the town where the film was shot, which was just amazing. So on our first trip, like I said, this is my great-grandfather's house. This is a house that my grandfather grew up in. It's large. It's both a residence and commercial. If you enter through the dark opening almost to the far right, if you go back, you'll see it's a courtyard and there's many apartments, so you could see the potential for a large family to live there. My great-grandfather was also a grain export merchant, so he set up his son in the neighboring town to carry on that family profession. And this picture is in the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Nashelsk. And that tiny little plaque was placed there the year before that when a group, along with Glenn, other descendants from the Matzeva Foundation, did a cleanup of the cemetery. Now, I'm not going to go into what that is because Jean has secured 2 of the leaders of that group to come speak to us in 2 weeks. But it's really amazing. It's another astounding Nashville connection to Poland and to my story. And then 4 years later, just last year, now in the cemetery, there's a huge information sign about the Jews of the town with pictures from the descendants. We installed, and there was a dedication ceremony for this archway to designate where the cemetery is. The townspeople were just amazing. They've learned so much about the history of the Jews in their town, and they want to know us and reconcile with us. So they brought the Jews of Nashelsk into living memory, not just a place of death. And on the right, that's my great-grandmother's tombstone. She died December 28th, 1928. And this would have been the unveiling ceremony, within a year of it. This is an exceptional tombstone. You could see it's 9 or 10 feet tall, it's about 4 feet wide, and there is a lot of writing on there. Those are different biblical verses praising the virtue of the woman who died. And in the white section, it explains that, who her husband was, and that her father was a primary student of the original Ger Chassid rabbi. So that's a very interesting avenue for me to do additional research. They had arranged marriages. So that's how I'm hypothesizing how my great-grandmother and my great-grandfather maybe were almost kind of emissaries to bring that branch of Hasidism to that small town. Don't know. But most of the Jewish cemeteries in Poland and throughout Europe, anywhere that the Nazis occupied, were desecrated during the war. Not only did the Nazis want to destroy living Jews, they wanted to wipe out any memory of Jews at all. So they actually tore up the tombstones and in many cases broke them apart and repurposed them as building materials. In the town of Nashelsk, they knew that a lot of those tombstones were used to create an airplane runway. Some of the fragments were recovered, and now there is a little, like a one-room schoolhouse that's like a town museum, and some of those fragments are in that schoolhouse now, and along with pictures donated by descendants. The thing that was the most moving for me of that time in Nashelsk, the second time in Nashelsk, was a walking tour of Jewish Nashelsk. The students had been studying about the Jewish descendants for a year, and they learned the main business in the town was a button factory. It was owned by 2 men who have the same last name as my grandmother. Now, I've gone back a couple generations, so I know they weren't first cousins, and I know they weren't second cousins. So now I gotta go back and get those birth certificates for the 3rd generation back. But they have to be related. It's not a common name. These towns are very close together, so I'm sure that they are related. So the townspeople themselves, so as Glenn was researching and publishing his book, and then as the documentarian did the film, Glenn made 10 trips, to this town over the course of 10 years, and there's quite a bond between him and the descendants and the local people. So this mural was actually a project that was taken up by the local people themselves. They raised all the funds, commissioned an all-female crew to paint this mural to honor that button factory. So now I'm going to bring it back to Nashville and unfortunately the current events. We're here, we study history because we want to learn. We want to learn from the past. We don't want the same mistakes to happen, but it can happen here. It has happened here. The Jewish Community Center was bombed in the 1950s. In 2015, there was shots at my synagogue. The Holocaust Memorial was defaced in 2020. Last year, shortly before I gave my first talk on this, the flyers on the left were distributed on a street in Richland behind two of the main synagogues. And this spring, you know, there was graffiti in Sylvan Park. Every minority is at risk. Nazis had 6 million other victims in addition to 6 million Jews. Handicapped, intellectuals, LGBT+, anyone who was not Aryan or resistors or useful to them. And I'm sorry, that's my timer. I can't. Oh, no, that's your timer. That's, okay, somebody else's. Sounds just like mine. Just last week, on Monday night, in the town where I live, a candidate for mayor had neo-Nazis protecting her at a forum.
There with the tattoos?
It's all 4 of those men, but of course the man with the tattoos is the most obvious.
Right, I saw him on.
Yes, well, Phil Williams, bless him, he has been hounding this candidate to disclose who she is. Her platform is just morality. She wants to outlaw the LGBT, the Pride Festival that the current mayor allowed to go forward. And, you know, she's got this morality campaign, but these are the people she associates. She did not deny them. She said, I just handled a real estate transaction for one of them. I didn't ask them to come. And they said when they were interviewed, well, there were credible threats against her, so we felt that we needed to protect her. I don't think that anybody in Franklin, Tennessee was going to attack this woman. So it's very unnerving that it is so close to home. I mean, if my father, bless his memory, saw what was happening, he would be astounded. I'm sure he's turning over in his grave that this could happen. And, you know, and this is just days before early voting started, so I'm just praying that my neighbors know, you know, what's going on and do not vote for this person. So what I am, again, asking all of you so much is to keep educating yourselves, learn what a hate crime is. There's a forum on October 30th at the Jewish Community Center with the Anti-Defamation League to educate us on what is a hate crime, how to report it, how to fight it. This is a picture of our Holocaust Memorial. I am the chair of the docents there. I would love, please, to give all of you and any of your friends a tour and tell you more about the survivors from Nashville. When those flyers came out last year, Betsy Phillips in the Nashville scene said, "No neo-Nazi cares if 100 Jewish people denounce him. From his perspective, that's just evidence he's doing something right. But if the neo-Nazi's friends and family call him on his bullshit, there's at least a small chance it could have an effect. If we want to live in a city where this stuff isn't welcome, we have to make it unwelcome from the start. And the only people who can do that are other white people." Thank you. Yes, please, 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 questions. Yes?
I was just going to mention Betsy did a great piece yesterday.
Oh, thank you.
About the mayor's race, and
Oh, wonderful, thank you.
David Plazas didn't really address the issue.
Hmm.
In his editorial.
Oh, come on, there's got to be some questions. Yes?
Yeah, so back to the town.
Yes?
My impression was that for several decades after World War II, there remained a lot of anti-Semitism in Poland. What's your sense of when it started to shift? Was it only in the last 2 decades?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So after World War II, Poland was a communist country. It was not actually ruled, by Russia, but it was Polish communist, and they clamped down, religion in general, but of course Judaism specifically. Bless you. In 1960 something, there was actually an expulsion of Jews from Poland, which was very tragic. When it changed was in the 1980s, when, with the whole solidarity movement, when Poland stopped being communist, is when it really started changing. And there were actually Poles who started a Jewish culture festival in the early 80s. So it was actually even a little bit before the wall fell that the Polish people started, trying to recapture this. On my 2 trips, I was amazed. That's the biggest thing that I was amazed at, was the welcome and the interest, especially amongst, the youngest folks, the millennials and the Gen Z. A lot of them are actually searching now to determine if they actually have Jewish roots. Because, some people were able to either fully convert or, pass as Catholic. That's actually how Mr. Chandler survived. He passed as a Polish farm boy. So a lot of those young adults are starting to look for their roots. And that's what I found, like the tour guides that I had. He had previously been a journalist, but he felt that he couldn't be open and honest enough. So that's when he started doing his own tours, and he does his own, research to really get the full story. I had, the second time that I went, I had an expert take me through there's a big, huge cemetery, Jewish cemetery in Warsaw, where my third great grandfather and one of his sons are buried. So I was trying to get to their graves. It's very difficult. So anyways, this man, he had owned a travel agency, and it was he started changing professions before the pandemic, but now he's an expert on these Jewish cemeteries in Poland. He just wrote a book that just got translated to English about the destruction of the Jewish cemeteries in Poland, and now the revival. So things are changing, and I would say that it was mostly from the 80s on, which is also when things started to open up more here. I mean, that's when my dad started doing his testimony as well. So yeah, you can't change everybody's mind. And when I talk to Jewish groups, I actually encourage them to go, to give the Polish people a chance. That even if their grandparents or great-grandparents may have been collaborators, may have done things wrong in the war, to try to have some level of empathy of the position they were in. That, the potential of sacrificing your own family to help your neighbor. And they want to know and they want to reconcile. And you can only do that with a partner. They can't just reach out from their side. They need us to reach back to them. So that's where some of my efforts locally are, doing these talks and giving the tours at the Holocaust Memorial. But I'm also working with other descendants and trying to convince other people my age, and even my own cousins, that we should go back together, that I want to show them what I found, and to meet some of the people doing this work in Poland to recover our memories. Anybody? Yes?
I'm a psychologist, and back in the 1980s when I was in graduate school, some research was coming out. I'm sure it wasn't the first, but it seemed to be more of a focus on generational PTSD.
Mm.
I'm sure you're familiar with that.
Mhm.
It's passed down
Mm-hmm.
through the generations.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like your family's done a wonderful, whatever, I mean, your father went through so much, but you've done so well considering that. He seems like an amazing person, and
Thank you for that. There was a lot of psychological trauma in my childhood. Yeah, I don't remember my dad having, nightmares or anything, but my siblings do. And he was very mercurial, his temper. You didn't know, you had to wait when Dad got home from work. You needed to be quiet, do your homework, let Dad go have a shower, have his nap, do his bills, and then coming to the dinner was very fraught of, did Dad have a good day at work, or is this gonna be a bad day? And you didn't know if you put something out of place, if Dad was gonna, go off on you. And now I can understand if his shoes, his clogs were in the wrong place in the barracks, literally it was a matter of life and death. If his hat was at the wrong angle, a Nazi could beat him. So, of course, as a child, you didn't know any of that, but, now I understand that. The other thing is that my mom was not a survivor. My mom was an American, and my mom was almost a Pollyanna. She was very trusting, very open, always, we're gonna get through this, and, but she was also bipolar. So you didn't know if you'd come home that day and Mom would be making dinner and, we're sitting and reading her big novels, or if she'd be sitting at the kitchen table crying. So yes, there was a lot. And my siblings and I, we've all had our medications and our depressions and our anxiety, and we can see it in our children too, to some degree. Oh, thank you. Yes. Yeah.
Me?
Yes.
Well, I had an experience in a laboratory, and I brought in a salesman to demonstrate an instrument. And the salesman started whistling. And the whistling was the signal that the Nazi guards were coming through the women's camp.
Wow.
And the woman was in the laboratory. She left, and our laboratory director came in and said, "Tell him to stop listening."
Wow. Wow. You don't know. You don't know.
And
Yeah.
another man that I worked with, he had to take possession of his children because his wife had no experience in raising children, and she was brutal.
Mm.
And
Mm.
that's that trauma that carries
Yeah.
through
Right.
generation to
Right.
generation.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
Your father did his testimony.
Yes.
He talked to you
Yeah, he did. He did.
as you were older.
It's so funny because I can't remember a time that I didn't know that he survived and the outlines of his story, but I do remember when, like, the actual reality of it, like what the extent of it was, that I finally understood that. And that was when I was 16 years old. I spent the summer in Israel, and we went to the Yad Vashem Holocaust Museum there. And when I saw all those pictures and everything, all I could keep thinking was, that was my dad, that was my aunts, and I really literally just cried through the whole thing. I think that was really the first time that it, really sunk into me of what it meant for him to have survived that. Now, there is one other Nashville connection that I forgot to tell you guys. Mr. Chandler had a cousin who was from Nashville named Harry Gordon. And when he finally decided that after the war that he was going to leave Europe, and he connected with another townsman who lived in Detroit, and he was going to get in on a student visa. They were giving special visas after the war to help train rabbis, because so many of the rabbis in Europe had gotten killed that there was a shortage of rabbis actually in America. So Mr. Chandler said that he would go to the yeshiva, but he had no intention of going to the yeshiva because he had been acting like a Polish Christian boy for, 7 years. But it was a way to get to America. So he had a place to stay, he had, things to do, he had a visa and everything. He just didn't have the money for the boat he was in Paris at the time, from France, to America. So he wrote to this distant cousin, and in one of his recordings he says, well, I remembered the name tag with all the E's and the N's and the S's and he remembered, he wrote the letter. The father had died, so it went to the dead letter section. But Nashville being a small town back then, the postman knew the man's son. So he delivered the letter to the son, and the son arranged for him to his passage over. And he lived in Nashville for I don't know how long, sometime in 1947, on his way ultimately to Detroit. And the grandson, Ralph Gordon, who was an entertainment lawyer here for many, many years, he just recently passed away. So, I went to the funeral and sent greetings from Mr. Chandler and told about how important it was that, and his, the deceased wife, the widow, said, actually, when Maury lived in Nashville, my husband, he was younger than him, but he would take him, he would go places with him because he didn't know English yet. So he would translate from Yiddish to English when Maury lived in Nashville. And I apologize, but I actually have a copy. Maury's daughter sent me a copy. There was an article in the Jewish News in 1947 about the Gordons bringing Maury over. So that was another one of the surprising Nashville connections. Thank you all so much. And